I'm pleased to introduce our discussion moderator and panelists for leading international education through COVID-19. Robert Carolin, one of our newest board members at ISEP. We're very pleased to have him from California State University in San Marcos. KJ Lee, Executive Vice President at Hanyang University, South Korea, and also a distinguished board member. Daniel Palm from Northern Arizona University, Davina Potts from the University of Melbourne in Australia, and Parnaz Sartoshti from San Jose State University. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you in the audience for spending time with us today, and I'll turn the discussion over to Robert.
Thank you, John, and thanks everybody at ISEP Central for putting this together. It's been a great opportunity for me to kind of learn a little bit more about my colleagues from around the world and up the road there in San Jose, and a little bit to the east there in Northern Arizona. What I would like to do is we have a series of 4 questions that we're basically using to kind of begin our discussions here for this panel, this very distinguished panel. What I would like to do is jump into the questions and just kind of do a round robin regarding our panelists and have them share briefly some of their insights based on those questions. And then at the end of our presentation, we'll actually leave it open for questions and answers and suggestions, right? We want to make this an interactive opportunity for everyone. And so with that said, I'm going to go ahead and begin with our first question. And so our first question is, what lessons can we learn from our colleagues in countries which were impacted early by COVID-19, earlier than in the United States? And what I would ask our colleagues, particularly those from overseas, to look at it from a campus perspective, a state or regional discussion, or a national conversation. So with that, I'd like to start with KJ, if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about Korea and emphasize a little bit on those various discussions.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Surprisingly and different from what we expected, the number of international student application this year at Hanyang University and other the Korean universities increased by almost 30%. Especially the number from China has dramatically increased. This could be a new message for the future trend of international student mobility, I believe. I mean, more Asian students, including, of course, in the Chinese, will choose to stay in their home continent like Asia, rather than travel to traditional overseas destinations like United States or Australia. We are now putting in place strategy to attract them. For example, the Ministry of Education in China regulate the intake of online courses and credits toward degree programs, which is a big struggle with the Korean universities, converting many of the courses to online during COVID-19 situation. However, the Korean Ministry of Education seek a mutual agreement with Chinese Ministry of Education that all the online courses taken at Korean universities would be acknowledged by Chinese higher education institutions. I'm sorry, I cannot hear you, Robert.
My apologies. Could you talk a little bit about some of the internal discussions on campus, as well as discussions with either the Ministry of Education as COVID started developing?
You mean,
yeah,
say it again.
Sure. So if you could talk a little bit about the internal campus conversations as
what?
Yes, as COVID started happening, and then also if there were directives or if there was a line of communication directly with your Ministry of Education.
Of course, we have done regular meetings by online with the faculty members and also the Ministry of Education, and also I'm coordinating the committee members. So we have quite well developed the systems. So also we got a lot of financial support from the government, especially from the Ministry of Education, to support our facilities and infrastructures.
Great, thank you. And Davina, I was wondering from an Australian perspective, I know your academic calendar started a little bit later than perhaps in the United States or other locations, but maybe you could talk a little bit about the preparation, I guess, for COVID and then the follow through.
Yeah, because of the timing of this, we started with students who were in Wuhan initially. We had about 400 students that we thought were located in Wuhan and started working with them very, very early in the piece. But then the Australian government, we're a very centralised country, started rolling out inbound travel bans on countries. So China was one of the very first countries impacted by that. So that started, I guess the start of the interruption with our students coming in was completely beyond the control of the universities to be able to do anything about that to support the students. And then I guess the second wave was when other countries started recalling students and supporting those students either to make the decision or to help them make plans. From our inbound program, we have about 700 students who come to us every year, every semester. And of that group, we ended up with probably about 2/3 who were studying remotely, who had returned to their countries. So we'd been in session for about 3 to 4 weeks. And it was a very sad time for our students to have to either make the decision or just to make the plans and make their way home at that time. So it was very early in our term, but fortunately we were able to support them through online options, particularly where students really needed the credit to continue with their degrees, which was actually most of our students. And then not too long after that, the Australian government banned all inbound and outbound travel. And that was a very special moment for us on a Friday afternoon, watching the entire world turn red on the Department of Foreign Affairs website as they effectively said, no one can come in and no one can go out, which it remains today and has thrown all of our student mobility plans completely up in the air as we're subjected to their rule rather than anything our institutions can do about that. So that has effectively blocked anyone who was an international student who was out, could not return to Australia and had to return elsewhere. And so I think the biggest learning we've had from this is we need quite complex and flexible mechanisms for risk management now, because so many of our students are not actually Australian residents, and the same rules don't apply to those. You know, sometimes you just have to make do with whatever you can, and effectively saying everyone has to come home, that's not going to work for us if 1/3 of our students are from all different locations. So in hindsight, it's kind of just that flexibility that we're trying to build in to everything we do.
Thank you. So maybe Daniel and Parinas, from a US perspective, if you could focus a little bit on some of your either campus dialogues, your state or regional discussions, and then obviously the national moratorium that came out as far as travel. So Parinas, briefly, could you talk a little bit about from your institutional perspective, how decisions were, who was involved in those decisions and what?
Absolutely. So the state of California, as most people are aware, in the United States, decisions were made on a state-by-state basis and even county by county. So our county, Santa Clara County, was one of the first counties that took action. And we had one of the first cases of COVID-19. As a result, on March 16th, we were told suddenly we need to move to a virtual mode, communicate with our students who are here, and help them get back to their home countries if need be. And I think Daniel can speak a little bit more with regard to Arizona and if that was different. But with California, as most people are aware, at the federal level, a lot was left to each state. And in the state of California, to the county So in our case, our institution, our president, and our dean of our college have been in constant contact with the Santa Clara County Health Department to make decisions.
Daniel, final thoughts?
Yeah, we were the first institution in Arizona to actually bring students back in late January, particularly from China. Our order for students to return back to the U.S. in large part came before even the governor's order for the state to remain in place and kind of isolate. And so we've been early to this, and we felt the impacts early on. I've lived in China previously and studied there for 4 years, and so had a decent understanding of what was happening. And so we were able to act in concert with the president's office. I've been in constant contact with our president's office here at the university to align kind of the university strategy with what's happening as well globally. This fall, we plan to be in person. So we have a bit of a strategy as well there. But definitely, as was mentioned, we were kind of left to our own and had to make a lot of these decisions. In concert with some other universities like ASU and U of A, we definitely worked together and talked and had open communication, but a lot of the decisions that happened were very individual, and there wasn't a lot of involvement from the federal or the state level. Even now, I would say to this point with regards to what universities are doing internationally, it's very much, we're making decisions we consider are the best for our institution.
Great, thank you. We're going to move to our next question because we want to make sure we get to all of these. What will international mobility look like in a panelist, for a panelist perspective vis-a-vis their country or region, and how are institutions preparing to host students in 2020 or 2021? So Parinas, let's start with you, and then we'll work our way around.
Sure. So San Jose State was actually one of the first CSU campuses that just called off all of our exchange programs for fall 2020. And right now what we're doing is we are in communication with our partners to discuss potential virtual exchanges for spring 2021. I mean, we're trying to be optimistic and hope that we can resume the in-person exchanges in spring. However, with the surge of COVID cases in our area, at least, I don't know, it's hard to be optimistic. But with that, we are definitely looking at the virtual exchange model and really incorporating the ICC piece in a pre-arrival model and even post-arrival model. Also looking at potential virtual faculty collaborations where students in the different countries can be working on certain projects. So we do have a lot of innovative and creative ideas to make this work, but really contingent on how COVID progresses, but also after our experience this year, thinking let's be proactive and let's discuss more of a virtual partnership for the next academic year as opposed to an in-person partnership.
Thank you. And KJ, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, well, your announcement to me earlier, and then about that that government funding that you had mentioned.
Well, actually, the funding is about the, one thing I'd like to show you is about the overseas campuses, because, most of the Korean universities hesitated to open its overseas campuses due to a lot of, the financial, the issues. However, these days, we got a couple of proposals from Asian countries, including China, to invite Korean universities, not only Korean universities, but also internationally well-known and very competitive universities open as branch campuses or franchise programs in their countries. So that, around 10 Korean universities are seriously considering to open, the branch campuses in China, okay, as a form of consortium, okay? So that one thing, we are happy about is our government is very much encouraged universities in Korea to open its the overseas campuses. Also, Chinese government financially, support us if we open our the other campuses. So this is one of the agenda that we are pursuing at the moment.
Right. And Davina, from an Australian perspective, what is it starting to look like for you in, maybe 2021, depending on what the government's rules are as far as travel?
Yeah, I guess this year we've pretty much written off in terms of any kind of mobility. We don't think it's going to happen. There is a small chance that there'll be some limited mobility in the Pacific region. So that creates some interesting possibilities, and we have seen an increase in students applying to go to New Zealand, which is fantastic. Australians traditionally don't think of New Zealand as a learning abroad destination, but we're very happy to be able to support that. And working with some colleagues with Dawn in ISEP on Pacific options. So how we might move students between our networks in the Pacific if we are able to open at least the borders to those countries. In terms of next year, we remain hopeful that because we don't commence until March, that we are able to receive students from our partners. But that will be totally dependent on government rulings. So we will proceed with plans for that and with accepting applications and all of those, hoping to host students and then just cross our fingers. There's also a chance that some countries will be able to enter and other countries won't, which is going to be a very tricky situation. And not all students understand that actually the universities don't have any control over the border decisions that the government is making. So for the sake of our students and their experiences, we are still hopeful and we'll wait until sort of maybe about October before we start to make any cancellation decisions for 2021.
Right. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Daniel, you're planning on opening up this fall, right? Does that include sending students abroad, or is it primarily for incoming international students?
Yeah, we made the difficult decision to not have students, to pause students studying abroad for this fall, even though we are welcoming students to our campus, here on the Flagstaff Mountain campus and throughout the state. One of the things we're looking at for this fall is really how do we prepare for at least a select group of partners to be able to receive our students. And we're looking very closely at how we further develop relationships with our partner institutions to really establish and understand their protocols and understand the environment in which our students will be in. There is a hope that, an optimism that this spring we will be able to send students abroad, but for the fall we're not. We have a number of students that are joining us through a virtual exchange that will happen this fall through a few courses, some of those that we're actually teaching in-house for students. And we're looking at this as a way of a kind of prolonged relationship, not only to have students take the courses, but also to really talk about what makes NAU, this area, special, whether it's the indigenous people that live here in Arizona, I believe owning as much as 40% of the state's land, so to speak, and also the Grand Canyon and many of the other things that are here that really make Arizona a special place and a unique place. And so really looking at that as to whether they can take courses that talk about that experience, but then also hopefully encourage them to come here in the spring as kind of an extended opportunity to get to know them and then hopefully welcome them here in the spring semester.
Thank you for that. All right, we're going to move on to our next question. Our next question is, what resources or best practices exist within the ISEP network that can help inform our institutional response and action plans? So let's go ahead and start with, so many choices as far as who to begin with. Davina, if you wouldn't mind starting.
I guess it's the collaboration within the network that we've very quickly been able to regroup on what happens if the Pacific opens. So that's been a great way of working within the network, because I think we're all like-minded and we want students to have the experience. And to enable that through a network like ISEP has been, well, we hope that will be something we'll be able to do. So it's given us a ray of sunshine in an otherwise dark place right now.
And KJ?
Well, actually, my office got email from overseas students, like whether we receive international student and exchange programs or not. So that's, the ISEP, if possible, would like to give a lot of detailed or updated information to member universities, whether the partner schools receive exchange student or not. Because they do not have any information at all, or very small information. So they do not know exactly whether they go the university or not. So like updated and very detailed information should be available for our member universities.
Terrific. Thank you for sharing that.
Okay.
And Parinaz, what about resources within the ISEP network?
So I'll kind of echo the same thoughts, in that I really appreciate all the emails that ISEP sends through, really comprehensive with great information, kind of reinforcing some of the ideas that we're thinking, and enabling us to think through some of the questions. So I'm just really appreciative of the whole network and the collaboration, but really the information sharing as well.
Great. And Daniel?
Yes, I think, for me, and for us, it's really been about this continuity throughout the crisis. I think it's been important, and ISEP's played a critical role in ensuring the safety and well-being of our students abroad. And so I commend ISEP for moving quickly, taking action when it was needed, even though there was no precedent for a lot of what was being done. So I think that kind of assurance that the ISEP network brings. But this does bring a larger point, which I don't necessarily want to put John on the spot here, but something to think about, I think, for the ISEP network moving forward is whether or not there could be something established as far as an ISEP certified campus that has the protocol in place to care for students in a very similar fashion that we would all expect, that has the best practices for how a campus would respond to any student who might become infected or might be around others who have, to kind of assure students and assure campuses that come this spring that they could feel as though these select group of campuses that have been vetted and maybe ISEP certified or whatever it's would be called, could really help with what I think ISEP, one of the things that ISEP's really good at, and that's that continuity and the understanding that we have a clear path to a partnership, we have great communication, and really there's, if a student's in trouble or an institution's in trouble, there's a partner there that's quickly accessible and will respond. So I think there's, probably this has been thought of, so I'm not suggesting that I have an original idea, but I think it's something that we're looking to actually send students abroad in the spring if it's possible. We want to be able to do that, but we felt as though this fall there was a necessity for institutions around the world to develop protocol and to establish their understanding of how they would respond and what they would do and what their campuses would look like. And once that's been done, our hope is that, including NAU, will be in a position to host students and to send students regardless, of course, within reason, but I think COVID is with us for some time. So I think there's a need to really develop structures around how do we respond to it? How do we ensure the well-being of our students? And how do we ensure that the institution we're sending our students to is going to respond in a like manner to an established set of protocols? So just a thought that I thought I'd put out, because I think it really helps emphasize so much of what ISEP's so good at.
Daniel, thank you. I was going to ask John if he wanted to add some thoughts to that.
Yeah, I will. And it is funny. I was literally just typing out this question because we had this conversation this morning, with the ISEP team as to sort of, should we put out guidance? And if so, how specific? And we started out, we have a draft of this that the team worked together, the staff to put together. And they said, well, should we look at, must have masks, there should be a certain rate of spread of COVID, or maybe 2 weeks or 3 weeks, without any cases before we would reopen. So we were looking at these criteria, and we started with the European Union. we had this looked at by lawyers, by some of our members of councils, the Council of Advisors, and tried to look at this, and we've kind of figured out that, well, it's difficult because, you know, not all institutions measure cases and data the same way, collect the data the same way, report it the same way, or with the same frequency. And so that's kind of a question I really do have for all of you as the panelists and the network. Is it more helpful for ISEP to be specific, you know, with really concrete data points that we think are prudent based on, you know, global health organizations, or should we be more general? You know, simply ask institutions to provide their plan and then allow students to make the decision. We had this same discussion on another webinar this morning. And we're still struggling with it, but we are working on it. So it was a perfect question, Daniel, not putting me on the spot at all. It's one I wanted to discuss with people.
I would respond real quick. I think that, you know, COVID is everywhere now, and it's especially some of the places that around the world are safer than even being here in Arizona, let's just say. I mean, just to be realistic. So I think it is worth, you know, some generalities, but also it probably includes a form that students would sign, as we would require, but ISEP may require, that releases a lot of the liabilities, obviously, for getting too specific, which I think lawyers would likely advise against. But I do think there's a large population of students. We had many students who were coming to us saying, we want to study abroad, tell us what to sign, we're out of here, you know, even right now. So I do think there is a space maybe for a select group. So maybe a few institutions in very particular countries that are doing very well. That could be opened up and then monitored, and maybe it's monitored on a city basis, maybe it's monitored on a campus basis, but something that's really well thought through, but also requires students to have a lot of their own, you know, kind of responsibility in all of this, and providing the opportunities of the network and as many assurances as possible, but not, you know, 100% guarantee, which none of us can give. So that's just a thought, because we have a lot of students who come we already have 400 students want to study abroad this coming, nearly 400 this coming spring. We had, you know, hundreds this fall, but that's a huge pent up kind of a group of students that need to study abroad, that need to have that experience in order for their degree program or whatever it might be. So there's some opportunities, I think, there if structured correctly. Just
Great.
my thought. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That dovetails nicely into our final question, which was innovative models and approaches to international exchange, short and long-term opportunities and whatnot, and can they be replicated? So, what I would like to just put a quick kudos to ISEP for being innovative. A quick anecdote from Cal State San Marcos. We had students who were stuck. They ended up coming home but didn't have any courses to take, and as a consequence we needed to get them enrolled rather late into some online coursework, and ISEP put out a call to member institutions from around the world in order for students to be able to go ahead and register for those courses. And ACT in Greece came through for us, and we had a fair number of students that were able to register for those courses. Had those students not been able to register for those courses, they would have lost out on $80,000 worth of financial aid that they would have had to pay back. So again, this is just kind of an example of how we can leverage the ISEP network in ways that are unique to the ISEP model. With that said, I'm going to go ahead and ask Davina, if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about what you would think of as possibilities for models for the new future, I guess, of both short-term and long-term programming.
Sure, and I can give you a very concrete example. So I'll give a shout out to our Study Abroad and Away team that came up with this model. They called it the VIP program, which is the Virtual International Partnership Program. So for our global study students, they have this requirement to study abroad. And so in the fall, they're not able to do that. So they came up with this model where the student is enrolled in a course here, and it's pretty much a buddy program, and they're connected with what was supposed to be our incoming exchange student or students, And really, it's going to be a 7-week prescribed program, but really a lot of reflection where the student here, the domestic student here, does a lot of reflection, but, you know, really having that conversation about the cultural piece and having prompts for them to consider on a weekly basis to really guide their discussions. So that's one way that we have become innovative and creative. We've also been discussing with faculty the possibilities of co-teaching virtual courses. And I'll let, I mean, there's other things, but I would like to let the other panelists discuss. I don't want to take up all that.
Thanks. Well, I'm sure we'll have time for additions. I was going to ask KJ if you had any thoughts about new approaches to exchange short-term and long-term opportunities.
Well, actually, I'd like to talk about the visiting programs. This is quite new from our perspective because, you know, as you know, around 60,000 Korean students are studying in the United States.
That's right.
But due to something, you know, about the visa issues and other things, you know, 1/3 of them are returned to Korea now. They are staying here and very hesitate go back to United States. Not only visas, the restrictions, but also the COVID-19, you know, the crisis. So that, you know, some of the American universities approach us to receive them as our visiting student status. It's like a one-way programs. Okay, so their students probably study on our campus, right? By paying for tuition. Our tuition probably definitely lower than their tuitions, right? But one condition is co-teaching. You know, the faculty members of Hanyang University and also non-faculty members of the university. So this is quite new model, and the number of applications is increasing very rapidly. So that this will be a very new approach to an exchange program, not exchange, just one-way, you know, visiting programs. Okay.
Great, thank you. Very innovative.
Okay.
And I was going to say, Davina, if you had any novel ideas for short-term and long-term opportunities.
Yeah, a number of universities in Australia are working with remote internships at the moment, and that's something that it seems to be going well for the students who are participating, and in some cases it might even be a better experience than actual face-to-face, or it may suit different types of students to be doing it that way. So I think that's a really, really interesting. I think it does need to be properly structured and scaffolded in a way that's meaningful in terms of the cultural exchange part, and to have an organization that's willing to work on that basis. So I think that's the space that we're watching most closely at the moment, because it has the potential long-term to open opportunities to a broader group of students who may not be able to travel. So we are thinking about those as on a more long-term basis and not really wanting to invest the resources in short-term solutions. So we're experimenting with one remote program at the moment, but not doing too much of that at the moment because we are hoping that we will get back to business as usual soon.
Great, thank you. And Daniel, I know you mentioned the tribal land possibility, kind of a new twist on student mobility and whatnot. Were there any other things that you have in your creative box to possibly look at for future endeavors?
Thank you, Robert. I think just the one thing I'd mention is that I think we may be approaching, at least for the short term, kind of a post-mobility world in which the numbers of students that we are typically used to receiving from abroad, particularly here in the US, is likely shrinking for the foreseeable future, and not only because of COVID, but because of politics and social unrest and many different things. And so there's a rush that I'm viewing of many of the institutions that I know and speak with, and many of the SIOs that I know, to actually start to develop these branch campuses in Asia particularly, to kind of circumvent a lot of the visa challenges, but also some of the healthcare challenges as well. So I think we'll see some of that. One of the things we've come up with here with a partner just south of the border, Mexico, is really around a course exchange. So they actually take an international course, an online course as they would like, and our students are able to do the same. And then if they select enough credits, enough courses are taken, there's actually an opportunity for an in-person experience as well. And this could be useful for those partners that are strategic, but maybe their students don't have the financial necessity to be able to, or ability, I should say, to be able to come to the United States. And so this allows them still to have an experience in the long term, but also allows our students to have an experience either online or in person as well. And kind of has been that flexibility that was talked about earlier, that we need to implement these methods or these modalities that are flexible, that don't just look to somebody getting on a plane, but really start to calculate. And I know this can be actually challenging for those calculating these numbers, but to actually look at how we can be as flexible as possible, because the core of what we do hasn't changed and what we want to accomplish hasn't changed. It's really the method in which we're trying to function in a world that is changing so rapidly that it's difficult for us to really come up with good solutions beyond what we have put in place. So we really need to dig back in and understand what that future looks like and how it can be as flexible as possible.
That's great. Yeah, so what I would like to do is just kind of summarize briefly these talking points. Again, with a question about, how involved was your institution with negotiations with local, state, regional, national conversations and whatnot. It really depended on the, I guess is how I would say it, is the DNA of your particular country or your particular jurisdiction. But I think the takeaway from that is that getting senior leadership involved at the early stages of planning. We right now have just been working on the possibility of having to create some hybrid programs, both at San Jose State and Cal State San Marcos, because we've been mandated by the state that all of our classes in the fall will be online. So having those early discussions rather than waiting for the last minute for things, you can never predict, right? Especially in international education, but nevertheless, know who those key individuals are, both on campus, at your state or governmental regulations offices and whatnot, is key. The other thing was, of course, looking at preparing to host inbound students and, international mobility and whatnot. I think we've come up with a wide variety of interests and ideas as to what those would actually look like. The hybrid model approach to things, for example, the idea of leveraging your governments, right? Perhaps there's some funding now that might have otherwise not necessarily been thought of as far as creating these new innovative ways of student-to-student interactions. Likewise, how is the ISEP network be able to be leveraged in terms of these types of possibilities? As Daniel mentioned, having some maybe pre-identified institutions overseas at various locations that kind of have some sort of, I don't want to say certification, but the good housekeeping seal of approval that says, yes, they have protocols in place to kind of handle what these things look like. We also mentioned, both KJ and Davina mentioned that the Pacific Bubble Travel Network, if and ISEP certainly is a key possibility for that, given our network, to sit there and say, okay, well, maybe the United States is not open for business right now, but maybe between Korea and Vietnam and Taiwan and Australia, they might be able to establish these types of opportunities. And then last but not least, is looking at individual course-to-course exchange, right? As opposed to, actually having, if student mobility is sequestered in such a way that the students aren't going to necessarily have that opportunity. Davina mentioned the opportunity for virtual internships, and making sure that if this is the avenue that you're planning on going on, that it needs to have a very firm rubric of outcomes and support on your campus. And then, of course, Parinaz mentioned the VIP program, which I think was an excellent way of engaging students virtually as part of their abilities. So with that, what I would like to do is open it up for questions, unless any of my panelists has any final thoughts that they want to share before we do so, including John, if you have any last minute thoughts that you want to share.
This has been great. Jump in with your questions or comments. I'm taking notes.
All right. So I'll turn it over to Carolin and to Jennifer to see if we have any questions from people, or if they want to unmute their microphones and ask the question that way, that's fine as well.
Yes, Robert, thank you so much. We would welcome some questions in the chat if you have any of them, or if you are comfortable unmuting yourself to ask the questions of the panelists, that would be great. One question that I wanted to share that I thought might create some useful conversation among ourselves is, how do you feel about this idea that's being floated out there that it's unethical to encourage our students to travel internationally for their studies in the middle of a global health crisis? I know we've touched a lot on how to work around some of that with virtual study, but for those countries that are welcoming international students, such as South Korea and KJ and your institutions, what our ISEP coordinators tell our students ethically it's safe to travel to these countries but not those countries? How do we respond to parents who are concerned about their young adult children traveling at this time? I'd be interested in hearing the thoughts of our panelists.
Can I?
Go ahead, KJ.
Okay. Well, actually, the safety of the international student is our first priority. So we just launched an infectious disease management committee to effectively control students' safety, not only on campus, but also off campus as well. The committee makes all the important decisions and policies in a very timely manner and develop a daily report system for international students to report their body temperature and health condition every day at the university portal system. So it works quite well so far.
Anyone else care to comment? And that includes not just our panelists. If anybody else has any thoughts on this, feel free to chime in if you want to unmute your mic. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll go. I don't have an answer. I think it's a very tricky question at the moment, and we might need a little bit more time to work on it. But we have been talking about what to do about insurance issues, and I think we're all going to be facing similar challenges in terms of many things will be classified as COVID-related events now. And so what really is the value of our insurance policies? Of course there are, but it does bring into question some of the systems that we've relied on in the past to keep our students safe, and how we might negotiate around some of those things in the future.
And Davina, could I just ask a follow-up question to that? So I know for students coming to Australia, they have the national insurance, right? The national health insurance. But for your students that go abroad, is it up to private insurance policies, or does the government also have its own insurance policy?
Mostly it's institutional insurance policies. But we've very much been looking at the US recently in terms of how we might get together to renegotiate some of those, because this issue has really raised certain practices within the insurance industry into our minds, and we've got to work out how to work around that. I think in the US you've got a lot more experience in dealing with mass numbers and have many more years of experience with insurance than we do. So that's another way of using a network, is to get best practice from other countries so we can try and learn from each other and what we should be expecting from insurance companies, because they're big global companies as well. Yeah.
Great, thank you for that. Carolin or Jennifer, are there any other questions?
Yeah, Robert, I think Heidi posted a question in the chat. Heidi, are you able to unmute yourself? I can read it if you're, there you are.
Hi, thank you. I want to thank all of the panelists and Robert. This is a really great discussion, and And I don't know what time it is for you, KJ, and the others, but thank you for being here for this great discussion. I wanted to mention something or ask a question about something that came up in today's, this morning's panel. I think several of the folks have seen a greater trend or more energy, if you will, being put into developing initiatives for internationalization at home. In other words, programs that will benefit all students on one's campus, regardless if they travel abroad or not in any of the internationalization efforts. Do you see a trend in this COVID-19 world at the moment for greater emphasis on those initiatives?
Good question, Heidi. Thanks for that. I was wondering if any of our panelists have any thoughts on that?
I'd be happy to take a stab at that. So I know at San Jose State, we have a very diverse and multicultural campus and a multicultural community. So we have started the conversation of tapping into that multicultural community, which I know there's also discussions with regard to, there's the multicultural lens versus the intercultural lens. However, it's an opportunity to bring those two lenses together. And so we're in discussion with that, but don't have a strategy at this point. It's just at the thought process. So developing the ideas behind that.
Great, thanks, Paryas. I'll just briefly add that we've created a task force on our campus for this very question about how do we go ahead and not only look at the new normal, but both from a student perspective, but also from a faculty perspective, right? Because what we're finding is that a lot of our faculty members have expressed interest in engaging with their counterparts at institutions abroad. And so from that perspective, they're asking, how do I do this? You know, what's the mechanism for that? So the panel that we have, the committee that we have is trying to come up with best practices, sharing links like the collaborative online international learning links and whatnot. And ISEP itself has a task force that is looking at that from a faculty perspective, not necessarily from a student perspective.
Robert, hi, it's Dawn. I just thought it was worth mentioning on Davina's comment earlier of not so much the on campus internationalization at home, but I think what's really nice to see is that the Australian students, at least, because that's my vantage point from where I sit, are considering options that are closer to home or getting to know their neighbors, as was mentioned before about a Pacific mobility bubble, or whatever you want to call it. And I think that's nice because students, in my experience in Australia, would never really consider just going across to New Zealand, and now it's seemingly a real possibility. And I think that's a really nice localized shift in mindset and also getting to know the neighbors. I think it goes the same for some of our neighbors in Asia as well. We still have, there's always been interest in the region, but the students weren't necessarily engaging with that region in their educational pursuits. It was more of a travel destination. And I think, again, there's some possibilities there. So I just thought I'd note that. Great, thank you, Dawn. Good to see you.
Other questions or comments from anyone at this point? You know, we're wrapping up in the next 8 minutes or so. So now is your chance to go ahead and jump in with thoughts, ideas, questions. Not sure if we'll have answers for you.
Hi, excuse me, this is Steve in Japan, and though I don't look Japanese, I am here. I wanted to comment on something Daniel said about the sort of shrinking of overseas study numbers. And I do think that is a dynamic we're going to be dealing with. But to speak for Japan, certainly, and maybe KJ can comment after I say this, but I think Japanese are really just beginning to get a hold of the idea of study abroad and wanting to go abroad. And so I don't think we're going to have less students going abroad in the future. I think we're going to have more, but their priority will be safety, both for issues of social unrest, but also COVID, of course. And they want to go, and they're being told they should go. So I think if this is sort of a request for all of you abroad, if you can present to Japan and I think much of Asia kind of as safe as possible experience, then I think there will be Asian students who want to join you.
Thank you, Steve. Appreciate that. I don't know, KJ, did you want to follow up with that?
Not much. Thank you.
I'll just we've just closed our what would be your spring semester applications, and we're at 2019 levels.
Wow.
Which is really, we found quite remarkable that so many of our students are still trying to go. So I think the same is that we will have plenty of students to be sending. So we hope our partners are also able to receive and to send to us.
Thanks.
Thank you. I think that's true. I think of what we've talked about with regards to, and I appreciate the information about Japan and Australia and things that are happening. I think the numbers may continue. But the question is, to the United States, will they continue? I think is part of what my comment was, but also, and I appreciate what you said, Steve, about us presenting ourselves as a safe campus or a safe place. I've actually written that down because I think that's part of the effort, a two-pronged effort. I talked mostly, actually only about working with partners to make sure they're safe for our students, but actually you bring up a great point, and that is how can we as campuses, once we start to move beyond this at some point, start to also share with the world that we are a place to be, and these are the kind of protocols and things that we have in place, and we're open for study. I think that's really important. But I think the larger trend that I'm seeing here among even just this conversation, but also seeing outside of this conversation, and that is that exchange is going to be happening in those particular regions. And with the large numbers of the population of the world being concentrated primarily in Central Asia and in Asia proper, that says to me that those areas will likely see a growth among each other and themselves, and that may include Australia as well. But that likely the United States and Europe may be the areas that actually see a decrease for the first time in 15 years, 10 or 15 years. So it's very interesting to see the shifts that are happening regionally, not just as a global shift. So thank you for your comments. That's fantastic thoughts.
All right. I was wondering if anybody had any final questions or comments or thoughts. And then at that point, I think, John, maybe you could close us out with just an ISEP perspective.
Yeah, just to say that, I mean, this is exactly why we all work with ISEP, either as members, affiliates, or friends and family. We have a pretty wide friends and family network here. And we're struggling. We don't have all the answers. I have some draft documents, and this has been really helpful in illuminating how we can provide some guidance to our members, because they often look to consortia like us or others, UMAP in Asia or the Erasmus Network, for some guidelines and to sort of how to think about reopening, as well as offering some of the new programs, hybrid programs, virtual programs that folks are offering. With again, that balance between, we had the same problem the same challenge that Davina raised earlier. How do we invest in these new things and embrace new technologies without spending so much time on that we don't support that demand for students who very much do want to go abroad when they're able to. And so we're struggling with all these pieces of the puzzle, but you've helped put a few more pieces on the table. And so I really want to thank our panelists and Robert for moderating this. It's been very useful discussion, and I hope it will continue online and virtually, and at some point, again, at some conference, over a nice glass of wine with all of you.
Well, you know, I echo everything that John has said, and I want to thank my panelists all for spending the time to kind of wrap their heads around those not so obvious questions that we put forward today.